Well, awesome. Let's go ahead and get started. We've got a decent amount of people in here. So I'd like to welcome Tai Fujimura for joining us for two sessions this conference. Yesterday, we got a Get Her Done talk. That was great, and I appreciate that. And then the business roundtable. So if your first day is today, you've already missed a lot, Tai. And Tai, I don't think we've actually ever officially met before this, have we?
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
Yeah. So, yeah, absolutely. We definitely have to make sure that happens down the road sometime. Hopefully next year in Philadelphia.
Yeah. That would be wonderful.
Yeah. So Ty's last talk for the conference is about image optimization, which is something that we were talking about earlier. It's like something we've worked on at my firm for a while, but I know we can do a lot better at it. And so I'm really excited some points about what Ty's going to talk about today is for a website to be a great experience, it needs to be fast, right? And that's important in a lot of different ways. And images have always been one of the heaviest aspects of loading a web page. And so when performance is important and paramount, standard image management methodologies can leave something to be desired. There are some limitations. There are some things that don't do the job as well as it probably could. And we're going to learn some methods for delivering perfectly sized and optimized images exactly the way our end users need. And so with that, Ty, I'm going to hand it over to you. And thank you so much for being a part of the conference this year.
Thank you. No, what a great intro. I really appreciate it. And I'm excited to talk about this topic. I'm very passionate about obsessive, detail like this. And it's really, it's neat to be able to control things the way you want. So one thing I wanted to ask quickly, I think we tried to do a poll maybe about about how familiar people are with HTML responsive image technologies like src set, source set, and the picture tag. I'm not sure if we got any specific answers on that. May or may not. But okay, cool. So yeah, if people want to just shout that out in the chat, that's really helpful for me. If people know kind of the basics of those technologies. Looks like, okay, cool. Yeah, so we have a smattering, some very experienced, some less. Cool. Okay, so I'll touch on it, but I won't go too deep. Okay, thank you. Another thing I want to mention is I really want this to be an interactive session. I'm happy for people to be to come on. If you have a specific question you want to come on camera, that's great. If you want to share something on your screen, happy to look at stuff. But also, if you have questions you would just want to throw in the chat, that's super easy, and I'll just kind of pause periodically to answer those questions. So I love a good back and forth. I think it's much more fun for everyone instead of me just yakking. So thank you very much. So in the beginning, back in the day, you had a very simple notion of what an image on the web would look like. We had the image tag, and it was good. And you would have your page, your page would be some sort of fixed width. It was probably in frames or something like that. Yeah, God created the image tag, and what could go wrong? Over time, as web technologies have advanced, particularly when it comes to responsive web design, it's become necessary for developers to have different tools to control the sort of nuances of how their images are loading and the different sizes of how things are coming through. Because obviously, if you're loading a large image for a desktop device, when a user comes to visit your site on a phone, you don't want them to have to download that entire image. So the W3C/God, whatever divine power you happen to believe in, came up with sort of two approaches to that particular problem. One is called src set, and this is kind of a drop-in replacement for the traditional source tag or attribute on the traditional, on the image tag, and it goes hand in hand with this other attribute called sizes, and I'll walk you through that in a second. There's another approach called a picture element, and a picture element is kind of it gives you the opportunity to art direct your images. So instead of just having different versions, different levels of quality of one image that's visually consistent, you can actually control more nuances of the specifics of an image. So let's say you wanted to have a full graphic on desktop, but you just want an icon on mobile, and you want to make sure that only one of those loads at any given time. The picture element is the way to do that. But that's not all. We have new formats, things like WebP, which are extremely optimized compared to traditional image formats like PNG and JPEG, but they're hard to work with. As far as I know, Photoshop still doesn't export WebP, and who uses Photoshop anymore anyway? So it's more relevant what Figma and Sketch do. But regardless, it's tough to work with WebP images. TJ, I'm glad I'm not the only one. We have user-generated content. So we have, especially on expression engine sites, you might be building an intranet. You might be building something where people are going into to add their own content, and they're going to be uploading content at a variety of widths and levels of resolution, also different formats. And this makes it tricky to manage when you want to display those same images actually in the front end to users, because you need to process those in such a way that they're optimized. We now have CDNs as kind of a standard technology on the web. So if you're, for most sites nowadays, you're going to have some sort of CDN that's serving your static assets, your CSS, your JavaScript, and your images. And that complicates things even further because you have to ensure that the CDN is managed properly. Another new format is AVIF. This is really just sort of making its way into browsers now. So yet another new kind of optimized format. And we also have lazy loading. Lazy loading is super important. And for anyone who's not aware, this is the act of deferring the load of images that are not on screen when a page initially loads, so that the user doesn't waste bandwidth downloading images that they never actually see if they never happen to scroll to that position. So yes, Jared, as you pointed out, there is now a native lazy load API that is W3C approved. It is not as widely supported as you would need yet, probably, to rely on it completely in production. I think it's Chrome only. And thank you, Benoit, for pointing out a plugin for Photoshop as well. That's very helpful for WebP. So point being, we used to have a very simple solution, which is this image tag with one attribute. And now all of a sudden we have all of these different factors that play in that we need to consider when we're building websites. So the approach that I'm going to walk you through today is using one particular service, which is called Imgix, their JavaScript library, which is sort of distributed alongside it, and a plugin called Lazysizes. And with those kind of two components, we're able to create an image distribution and resizing solution that is extremely powerful and also flexible and can work for many different websites. And it has some upsides, it has some downsides. I'm going to walk you through all of that. Quickly, a little bit about me. I am Tai Fujimura, CEO of Cantilever Web Design and Development. We are a fully distributed team of 11 across the US and Canada. I have 2 kids. I live in Fair Lawn, New Jersey, a little bit out of New York City. Expression Engine has been really important for me in my career and my life. When I was first kind of breaking into the industry, it was one of those things that was really like a level up moment for me. Learning Expression Engine, figuring out that, unlike in WordPress, I don't have to associate all my content with one particular page, but that I can actually create all these different channels and combine them in different ways. And I remember, my first couple Expression Engine projects just wanting to stay up until 1 and 2 in the morning so that I could do more coding because it was just so powerful. So I'm really grateful to Expression Engine for how it helped me progress as a developer, and also to this community. I've met so many great friends and even colleagues through this community. So pleasure to be here and to speak at this conference as well. And I wanted to share this particular technique because it's not super common. Usually when people are working with us at Cantilever, they'll say like, oh yeah, I've heard of Imgix, or maybe I've played around with it, but I've never really implemented it on a site. So I thought it was a good topic for something that people might be interested in, but might not have kind of really kicked the tires on yet. Okay, so I'll do a brief version of kind of how responsive images work for anyone who's less familiar. The way that this is showing some examples of how source set can work, and I'll talk about the picture tag a little bit as well. Source set is kind of the simpler option of the two. So the way it works is that you still, in your image tag, have your normal SRC declaration, just like you would for any image. But alongside that, you're also able to provide sort of an array of different versions of that same image. And when you do that, you provide also the sort of physical pixel width of the version of each version in your array. So in this case, we have an image that is sort of by default, it's going to be its small version, but there's an SRC set tag that provides information on other versions of this same image. And what the browser will do is it will look at those, and it will look at the window size, and it will decide what's the most appropriate version to serve for the user. So how does it know what's the most appropriate version? We also have this sizes tag. And what the sizes attribute, what the sizes attribute says is it tells the browser in advance how you're intending to style the image and what its ultimate size is going to be. So normally, if the browser wanted to understand how big an image was, it has to actually flow the entire CSS and paint the page, which is processor intensive. And so that would actually slow down, the loading of the proper image. So instead, what we're able to do is in advance tell the browser what size this image is going to be rendered at. And the browser kind of combines those two pieces of information to decide which of these versions of this image it's going to serve. So the simplest case is if you're on a normal single pixel density monitor where one physical pixel equals one browser pixel, so you're not on a Retina screen, the browser is likely going to pick the version that is larger than the size, that is the smallest version that is larger than the current size of the image, if that makes sense. So if you're going to render your image at 500 pixels wide, the browser is going to pick the smallest version that's greater than 500 pixels wide so that the user doesn't get a fuzzy image. And it behooves you to provide kind of as many versions of this, of each image as you can, because the more versions you provide, the tighter that chosen version is going to be to the actual size of the image. And yeah, Mike, so the way it works is that the browser will read the sizes attribute and will determine what the size of the image, what you're telling it the size of the image is going to be. And it will then refer into the source set and say, which version of the image do I need? And what you can do with the sizes attribute is you can provide multiple media queries. So you can say, let's say it's an image that's going to show up sort of in the body of the page on mobile, but in a sidebar on desktop. That's kind of the case that we're dealing with here. We're saying that at mobile sizes, or sort of at the default size, this is going to be 100 VW, which is the full width of the viewport. But after 36M in page width, it's only going to be 33% of the viewport. So in the sizes tag, you're able to get pretty nuanced to give the browser advanced instruction as to how large you intend to render this image. One other thing I would mention is that it's not just about strict pixel size. If you're on a Retina device, the browser might decide to download a larger version because it knows that you're on a Retina device. So it might download more than it technically needs to fill the pixel space because it knows that it's going to be rendering at a higher pixel density. So the more image information it can gather, the better. Now, it will also make that determination based on your bandwidth. So it will determine if you're on a bad connection, maybe it's not going to bother to download a size that's Retina ready, even though technically your screen would support that because it doesn't want to waste bandwidth. So the browser is very, very smart about figuring out the optimal version of an image to get. And that's why, again, you want to, when you're building an image tag with source set, you want to add as many possible versions of that image as you can so that you have, the browser has a lot of choices. And you want to be as accurate as you can with your sizes declaration. Briefly, I'll touch on the picture tag. The way that works is that you have kind of a tag pair. And the way the tag pair works is that, similar to a video tag, there's a base image that is kind of your default or normal status of that image, but you're also able to define these kind of alternate sources that apply based on certain media query criteria. So you create a source tag and you give it some media query, and you can give it an alternative SRC set to use. So it's not just other versions of the same image, it's actually potentially other images. So a picture tag is used in a more art directing context where you actually want the visible effect to the user to change. Lastly, I would say if you're new to this concept, this article by Eric Portis is the best explanation of these concepts I've ever come across. It is definitely how I learned this. This is how I refer to this for people at Cantilever who are new to these concepts. So definitely read this out. Yeah, Jared and Justin, I will get to that. EE6, you can add image manipulations in the template, so you can make these kinds of things very easily. So that is the first of our many possible approaches, actually. So currently, EE has image manipulations built in on upload, and I believe you can kind of regenerate those. So when you have an image field, you can set it to automatically create multiple different versions of that image, and then you can call those versions within your template. And in the future, in EE6, it's going to have more on-the-fly kind of image transcoding and modification, the same way that CE image or Ansel or other technologies would work. Actually, that's not how Ansel works, but TJ can confirm. And so you can see how you might combine that with a tag like this. If you have 4 or 5 different versions of a given image on your server that all correspond to different sizes, you could put all those different versions of that image into your source set tag, and the browser's going to then have lots of different choices as to what to pick. So that's a really nice approach. Or if you need different art direction, like you want to change the crop mode on an image between mobile and desktop, or you want to change the quality setting between mobile and desktop, you might want to use a picture tag and use that in combination with expression engines, either the current built-in manipulations or the on-the-fly manipulations. Ansel is a plugin by TJ, who's in the chat today, which is another great option for kind of leveling up that image manipulation methodology. So you can do more selective cropping. You can do more kind of like in advance configuration of how you want your images to actually appear. So that would be especially good to use with the picture tag. CE image is a sort of tried and true tool in Expression Engine, also for doing on-the-fly image manipulations that might be better in some cases than what's coming out in EE6. I'm not sure. Not everyone's going to be on EE6, so I thought I'd shout that out. We've used that a ton, and it's very, very powerful. And finally, we have this approach with Imgix, and Imgix is a totally different kind of approach. The only reason that it's bolded here is because it's what I'm talking about today. I'm not saying that this approach is any better or worse. I think in technology, there's really no such thing as better or worse. I think it's all about just expanding your toolkit and understanding all the different kinds of approaches that you might be able to take to solve certain problems. So this particular approach that I'm walking through today is not for every situation. It's really, it has upsides, it has downsides, and you need to make the determination based on who your client is and the use case for which you're building the website. I haven't used channel images too much, Edward. So, and yeah, okay, good to know, Justin. So yeah, it might be a little out of date in my recommendation there, but there are wiser heads in the chat who can help if you're looking for a tool to manipulate images. Now, in conjunction with this, we have the problem of lazy loading. As I mentioned, there is now a official lazy load API that is, I think, shipped in Chrome at this point. And I am, in this talk, using the Lazysizes library, which is what we have been using for 4 or 5 years to solve this problem. But if you're comfortable with the browser support that you're getting with the lazy load API, I would totally go for that as well and combine that with any of these technologies, really. to solve that particular challenge. So I'll show you an example of how Lazysizes would work with Imgix, but other approaches are valid as well. Oh, and I have my little bullet points way out of order here. So how it works, I'm going to walk you through these two tools, and then I want to show you some more kind of real world demos of how they work. So Imgix is a service. Imgix is not by itself anything you install to your website. It's an external service. And the way it works is that it's primarily a CDN. And if you're not familiar with how a CDN works, a CDN will act as kind of a middle layer between a user and your files or your content from a server. So the way Imgix works is that when someone requests an image, they request it from a special URL that you configure, and Imgix will in turn go fetch that file from your server. And obviously Imgix doesn't have to get the same file over and over. Imgix will cache files that it has previously gotten. And Imgix has distribution servers all over the world, so it can create a nearby connection to a user. So just by acting as a CDN, Imgix will help speed up your image loads. But obviously many people are already using different CDNs like Fastly or CloudFront or Cloudflare sort of acts as that CDN as well. So that in and of itself is not a huge advantage. What is a huge advantage is that you can do on-the-fly image transformation, reformatting, cropping, rotation, color correction, quality changes, text overlay. You can combine multiple images. And this is all done through a URL-based API. So you have a sort of base image URL. I'll show you how this works. And then you're able to add different parts of the query string that tell Imgix the way that you want to manipulate that image. And Imgix on itself is really great, but by itself, it doesn't really do what we're talking about here. It's not going to automatically make tags for you that utilize it in any particular way. So that's why the company Imgix released this JavaScript library, imgix.js. And what that does is it allows you to very easily create super condensed and comprehensive source set declarations for image tags so that you can take advantage as much as possible of the power that Imgix provides. Lastly, this is not an ad. There are competitors to Imgix. Imgix is the one that we use the most at Cantilever and have the most experience with. But again, I think the main thing to impart, or that I'm trying to impart in this discussion, is about this technique and this way of approaching your images, not necessarily this one service, but I definitely recommend trying this service as well. Bhavin asked if this compresses the image with a given percentage, and yes, you can do compression by any sort of metric you want. So what I'll show you first is this sandbox. And the way it works is that they've got a bunch of examples here. I'll give you like a simple one here. So this image is some sort of base frog image. And then when passed through the Imgix CDN, here, I'll pull up the original here. This is kind of the base URL of what I was just looking at. And in Imgix, you can pass in different parameters to change different aspects of it. So you can see here in the URL, we have that the fit is a crop fit. So what it's going to do is crop that image. It's going to set its height to 400 and its width to 800. It's doing exposure correction. And it's actually adding this text label for ribbit as a base64 string here. And it's dictating what the font should be and the color and the alignment and all that stuff. And it's doing all of that through the URL. And what I'm able to do is just pop in here and I can just change values in this URL, and it's instantly going to generate fresh versions of that image for me using the same parameters. And keep in mind, these versions of these images have never existed before, potentially, unless someone tried to do this exact same thing. And they don't have to exist anywhere on our server. We don't have to maintain them over time. We don't have to make sure that they get regenerated if we change the size of an image or anything like that. And this is kind of just the beginning. Other kind of on-the-fly manipulations that you can do are things like face detection, which is really cool. I'll show you that. Watermarking is really handy if you have a website where people are stealing your images all the time. You can add parameters about what watermark you want to add, and then different sizing manipulations as well. The color correction is also really neat. Another neat trick they have is you're able to get a color palette out of your image. So normally in Imgix, you access an image and then you get an image. But they also have endpoints where you can send an image and you can get, I didn't realize it was CSS, but apparently you can get CSS. I thought you got JSON. But what this does is it gives you the actual color palette of an image as something that you can use in your website. So if you, let's say you wanted to, you're working on like an intranet or a social media site, and you wanted to allow the user to upload their image and then color change their profile page based on the colors of their image, you'd be able to do that with something like Imgix. It also supports pixelation and quality manipulation. And that is particularly useful if you want to use the sort of medium.com effect of having a low quality image that loads in very quickly. Thank you, Thomas. So yeah, you can get JSON as well and not just CSS. So if you want to load an image of sort of low quality, low size version of an image immediately, and then kind of blur that into the full resolution version as it loads in, you would be able to accomplish that with Imgix. So this is a very cool service, but how can we actually use it? I realized I didn't plug my computer in, so I need to plug my computer in. One second. Okay. So for this talk, I put together a collection in CodePen of a number of different demos. I'm going to put the thanks, TJ. I'm going to put the link to that here in the chat. And Aaron, I'm not positive what the EE6 image manipulation tags will be able to do. I bet it'll be able to do some similar things. It'll just be doing them on the server. And that's one thing I wanted to mention, is that anything that you do on the server, on your actual web server, you need to be mindful of the processor load that's going to cause. So we've had plenty of situations where we wanted to make some really complicated include that had a lot of different options, and maybe it's technically all possible with something like ImageMagick, but it just takes so long. Like it takes 4 or 5 seconds at minimum, or maybe it uses too much memory and crashes the browser, and that's no good. So you have to be very, very careful if you're doing server-based image manipulation. And obviously, the experts who build great plugins have various ways to work around that, but it's just something you need to keep in mind. Yeah, Jared. So yeah, exactly. Most of these packages will, if they're doing on the fly transcription or transcoding, they will only do certain manipulations on the first load of that particular image. But like if you're making a source set and you have 5 or 6 different versions of an image, you would need to transcode all 5 or 6 initially at the same time up front, or do that on the server, which kind of carries its own downsides. So that's one thing that Imgix does kind of help with versus other solutions. And I'm going to pull up my first example from the CodePen here. And this is an image that, this is my colleague, Nikki Munson, who's our Director of Operations at Cantilever. This is an image we use on our website. And we have our own Imgix installation, and it runs on a subdomain. And this is how we serve the images that you will see if you go to our site, which is cantilever.co. And you can see here, I'm just doing a very, very basic modification of this image, just cropping it to a square. Again, I can change different parameters and have different versions of the image show up. And I could add, via the URL API, I could add all those different crazy tags that I was mentioning, and I will actually show you some of those. So the second thing we could do to leverage Imgix, actually, you know what? Before I move on, why don't I just pause there, because I just covered a lot of stuff. Does anybody have any other questions about either source set picture tag or kind of what Imgix does. I know it's a lot of material to go through quickly. Imgix is not free. It is $10 a month minimum. Most sites that we use, so the way it works, it's like S3 where like it's billed based on usage, but they have that floor of $10 a month. So most of our sites end up costing $10 a month, and some of them might cost 20 or $30 a month, but it's you know, not a huge amount. And Chris, yeah, how do you implement it in an EE template? I will give you some examples of how you would do that basically through these code pens. But the short story is you have to export your images from EE into a format that Imgix will be able to process. So just looking at this example on screen, for instance, I could totally remove this part of this image tag and put in some sort of tag in there for expression engine, which would be in some sort of, you know, loop, right? Channel entries or something like that. So you can sort of dynamically create these URLs using data that's from expression engine, and that would give you the ability to implement Imgix directly for files that are on your server. One thing I wanted to mention also is that if you're going to be using Imgix and you're also developing locally and you're working with other people, there is a little bit of an issue where Imgix can only ever see the files that are public. So it can see all the files that are on mydomain.com, but it can't necessarily see the files that are on staging.mydomain.com. It definitely can't see files that are only on your machine. So generally what we'll do when we're using Imgix is we'll pair it with a solution that lets you put your images in a shared cloud location like S3. TJ, again, has a great plugin for doing that in Expression Engine called Treasury, and other solutions are out there as well. Angie says, how do you build clients for it? We ask our clients to make the account and put in their credit card information and then send us the credentials. And then we change the credentials and keep it in our 1Pass vault. So we try as much as possible to just get clients to pay for stuff. But you could also potentially bundle it in if you're managing hosting and things like that. You could add it as an additional service and even upcharge for it as well. Aaron asked how you get images from EE to Imgix. That's a great question. Yeah, I should have covered that a little bit. So the way it works is that Imgix is configured to look for images on a certain location on your server. So I'll show you the dashboard. You can make multiple sort of distributions, which they call sources. This is the one we're looking at right now. And the way this works is that, here we go. It looks at this base URL for the images that I'm loading. So here's an image from our Imgix distribution. And what that means is that if I look on this URL, oh, sorry, I forgot a part of the path. I get the original image. So you can see this original image is actually pretty huge. And when Imgix gets this request, it's going to sort of parse out that aspect of the URL that is after the subdomain, and it's going to tack that on to the base URL that it has in its configuration to find the original image. As I mentioned, we're using, in this case, DigitalOcean Spaces, which is a sort of S3 clone by DigitalOcean. We do our hosting on DigitalOcean, so it's a good fit. But you can also use S3 for this, and you can also just use a web folder on your server. But as I mentioned, the downside of using a web folder on your server is that if you have an image that you're working on in local development, it's hard to get that kind of up and through Imgix and back to your computer. It gets really hairy and you get a headache. So, so external file storage is great for that. And Bovin says, can Imgix be installed on a shared server or installed via the cloud? It's a SaaS product, so you don't have to install it. It is automatically ready and provisioned for you. You just have to configure it so that it's looking at a particular location. Cool. Thank you all. Those are really great questions, and you caught some stuff I missed, so I appreciate that. Okay, so moving on. One more question is how to use the image base URL in EE. Does anyone know the tag? I forget, but just to get the path part of an image. Someone maybe can put that in the chat, but I think that's, yeah, there you go. Okay. So one thing we could do with Imgix would be, let's say we have this image and we have this all set up. We could go through and we could make source set declarations for images, and that would be pretty useful. So we can manually say, I want to add, these different versions of my image, and maybe you can put in that variable in here to get a certain dynamic image from your server, pass that through Imgix, and make a bunch of different sizes of it. And what you're seeing here is we have the same image, and I've added a watermark to it through Imgix. So this is the 1000 pixel wide version. And we can also go down to a 500 pixel wide version. It's actually not going to load because the browser will only pick the one that it needs. So let me see if I can get that to. You have to kind of like trick Chrome into doing this. No, I can't trick Chrome. Okay, never mind. But anyway, you can sort of make like a manual source set tag like this. You can give it different versions of your image. Oh yeah, the reason I can't trick Chrome, I'm sorry, I should have remembered this. I'm on a Retina display here. It should be working out anyway because I'm in the Chrome inspector, but I can't get it to load the 500 pixel version. I have these watermarks here where it'll kind of show visually which version is loaded. We do that a lot when we're working with source set because it can be confusing. And if you're looking in sort of the network panel of your browser, it might be loading a version because it thinks it can, as opposed to because it needs it. And it's good to be able to tell when that's the case. So this is sort of like a basic, step one way that you might leverage Imgix to improve your images on your site, but it doesn't solve a lot of the problems that we were mentioning earlier. Another basic example would be to use the picture tag. So here in this version, what we're doing is there's a version that has just a simple art direction where we have a large version and a small version. But we also have a version that is further art directed by cropping in on the face of the subject of the image. So as I scale this pane down, you'll see it change. And there you go. You can see if you can even see that, it might be a little small, but there's this little watermark here that says 500 pixels wide. That's a straight up resizing of the same image. But using the Imgix API, what we can do is we can actually crop down to a different aspect ratio at that different size. And when we crop, instead of just cropping to the center, we can choose to crop to a face. And you do that by saying crop equals faces. So that's really, really handy, especially for user-generated content, because a lot of the time it will crop awkwardly. Or if you have a site where like in mobile, you want like portrait style images and they have to become landscape style images, it's really helpful to be able to do that. It has another crop mode that's called entropy, and entropy will pick the most active part of an image. So even if it's not a face, it will crop to the busiest part of the image, which is typically going to be the subject. Okay, next example. So this is neat. Excuse me. Coffee. Excuse me, too much yakking. Aaron, can I do face or something else? Yes, sure. Let me show you what this image looks like without that mode. But I think if I don't provide the mode, it'll just do the center. Yep. So that's the center of the image, and that that happens to be okay in this case. But if I was dealing with a different image, or if I was dealing with something that was more sensitive in that regard, I might want to have it actually crop to the face. The entropy crop, I think, is going to, on this image, yeah, if there is not a face, then do this form of crop. Yeah, so that would be entropy. And entropy, it looks like, picks basically the same zone for this particular image. But in a different image, it's going to pick whatever it is. Even if it's a still life, it'll pick the most active part of an image. And I think you can do both. So you can do like fallback, but I'm not positive, so I can't say for sure. Yeah, thank you, Thomas. Yeah, that's exactly it. Okay, so this is cool. Making these manually is cool, but it's not very convenient because you have to write a bunch of crap in your expression engine template to get all these different versions of the image and determine what the different tiers are going to be. So it becomes kind of hairy. And that's why Imgix produced Imgix.js. And Imgix.js is a JavaScript library that does this job for you. So it's something you need to install and kind of pull in on your server. And here in CodePen, I'm just pulling it in as an external dependency here, which just puts it in the footer. And that's how you would do it. You can also install it with NPM or whatever builder you're using. And yes, Mike and Thomas, you can set a focal point and crop to specific zones. It's a little tricky, and it's not visual as well. So there's no, like, Ansel has like a UI to pick, what you want. And that's not something you can do in Imgix. You have to pick just by the numbers. So the way Imgix.js works is it's a script, you load it in, and then you have to provide it with a little bit of information on your Imgix installation. So what you need to tell it where your particular source is. So in my case, it's climages.imgix.net. And then I want to force HTTPS, so I have to say that as well. I don't want to load HTTP images because they won't actually load on my secure site. So what Imgix.js does is it processes an image tag based on these kind of special attributes, and it generates a source set for the image that is based on all the different possible versions of this base image that it has. So I'll slow down and go through that in detail just with this initial example. Looking at this tag, it doesn't have an SRC declaration. So it's not going to actually load anything unless Imgix.js does something to it. But if I look at it in the inspector, I'll see that it still has that IX path tag attribute, but it also has this source set. And what the source set says is these are a bunch of different versions of this image, and that's what Imgix.js generates for you. So all you have to have in your markup is that very, very simple declaration of what the path is, and Imgix.js makes this source set for you. Of note, it doesn't have to make these images. All it has to do is make the URLs, and it'll work. Josh asks about issues or drawbacks. I'll get to that. I have a specific list, and they definitely exist. There's not a magic bullet at all. I'm going to speed up a little bit because I'm coming up to time. And another thing that you can do with Imgix.js is you can provide it parameters in a JSON format. So you don't have to write the full settings for your image in the URL, which is kind of awkward. You can give it this attribute and do it that way instead. And you can kind of change this stuff up the same exact way. I have an example of how this works with picture. I'm going to skip that for time, but you can look at that in the CodePen if you would like. It's very similar. And that gets us pretty far, but we're still dealing with this issue of lazy loading. So let me come back to that real quick. I'll come back here a little bit, and then I'll come back to what we do to deal with lazy loading. So the upsides of using Imgix are that you're going to end up wasting a minimal amount of pixels because you're only ever going to serve images that are very, very close to the actual resolution that the user needs. as determined by the browser. Another upside is that you can configure it to always deliver the ideal format for the user. So if the user is on a browser that supports WebP or in the future AVIF or whatever the next thing is, Imgix is going to read that via a request header and will serve the images that in the format that is ideal for your user, and that saves a huge amount of bandwidth. All your images are going to be automatically CDN, so you don't have to worry about setting up a separate CDN for your images. I'd still recommend it for your other stuff. Your images are going to be automatically compressed, so you can set this as sort of an account level feature, or for a particular image, you just add a quality variable to your image, and it will compress it down for that percentage. That's really helpful for user-generated images. Usually you can compress down to like 70% or 80% without anybody really noticing. And you can get even more aggressive for sites that need to be even faster. And there's all sorts of crazy art direction options, as I showed earlier. You can add, all sorts of coloration and different settings that really give you a lot of creative control. And you have all those really cool crop modes. These are the upsides kind of the Imgix approach. The downsides are it costs money, costs $10 a month, minimum. It's a third-party service. It can go down. I think in the time that we've been using it, it's only had one outage that I can recall. But when they're down, your images are down. So that's not fun. You have to make sure that people who are onboarding on the project understand that it's using Imgix, which is a whole kettle of fish. On the site, it has a small JavaScript dependency. Imgix.js is only a few KB, but we're very sticklerish about every line of JavaScript that we send to a user, so you have to make sure it's justified. As I mentioned, local development can be tricky, so you are best off using something like S3 or DigitalOcean Spaces to manage that. And caching. So Imgix has an extremely aggressive cache for good reason. They want you to be able to generate an image and then serve it literally millions of times. But the downside to that is you can't do a blanket clear cache except through their API. There's no backend for that. And in the backend, you can only specify one particular image that you want to clear from the cache. So generally what we do is if we're using Imgix on the server, if we're using Imgix for a site, we will make sure that new images get some sort of timestamp or something like that, or version in the actual file name that ensures that we're going to be serving new versions to every user. Gilbert, I think you could probably work something out. You could check, you could ping it or something. I'm not sure if it would be worth it ultimately. But regardless, even if you have a fallback, you have to think about it, and so that's a downside. Okay, but wait, I mentioned we still haven't resolved the issue of lazy loading, and lazy loading is super critical. So even if you are optimizing the size of the images you're loading, if you're loading 9 images on a page that you don't need, that's still going to waste a ton of bandwidth. So let me show you how Imgix can coordinate with Lazysizes. First, I'll show you how Lazysizes works. And let me show you in this view. So this is the same kind of situation that we were dealing with before. And I'll open up my network panel, and I have kind of a list of the images here. It's a longer page that I'll scroll through. And as I scroll, I'll just load it one more for good measure. You'll see kind of images loading in. That's the lazy loading effect. So let me show you how the code works for that. In this case, I'm not actually loading imgix.js into this code pen. So this is purely using the Imgix URLs as my image source. And the way Lazysizes works is you just load the script, which I'm doing here. And you add the class lazyLoad to your image. And instead of having a source, you just put a data source. So data source is meaningless to the browser, which means the browser will not load your image initially. And Lazysizes is in charge of swapping out data source for the source attribute when the user is within the right distance of the image. And it's extremely smart about this. It'll only load images that are it'll load images that are within a certain threshold of the viewport. It will take advantage of spare network latency to load images more aggressively when it can, or it will defer image loads when the network is busy. So it's very smart. But again, you can also use now the lazy load API increasingly for production as well. Okay, so lastly, putting all these pieces together, and I apologize for moving a little bit fast. I'll hope to get to those final questions as well. This is kind of the combination that I wanted to talk about today. So this is combining both Lazysizes and Imgix.js. What you have to do in order to facilitate that is you need to modify Imgix so that instead of Imgix creating source set attributes and source attributes, you need it to make data source set and data source, which still are not meaningful to the browser. But when you pass the image then through Lazysizes, it will ultimately generate a source set and a source that only happens when the image is in the browser, and it will generate the full comprehensive source set that we talked about. Okay, so I'll show you this in the debug mode so that I can show you the DOM a little bit. And again, we're going to have certain images that load initially, and as we scroll, we're gonna the browser is going to load more. You can see I have different transforms on this, including some I can't get to probably right now. And so this is kind of that holy grail of the user's experience, in that they're only ever going to get the images that they need. They're going to get them at exactly the size and exactly the format that they can best use. And we have the opportunity to do art direction and all these other neat things on the fly to make the site as streamlined and optimized as possible. But obviously there's a lot of setup, so if you look at the code here, we have our images, and every image needs, a bunch of stuff to make sure that you can get the effects that you're looking for. And you end up going from that, that original image tag that I showed you from 1993 has become something like this alongside 2 JavaScript dependencies. So definitely not trying to downplay that, but I wanted to demonstrate this and show you this as an option for how you can create a really, really robust and powerful image management solution that will apply to Expression Engine or any other system that you happen to be using. So I know I had to go a little fast at the end there. If anybody has any additional questions, or if there's anything in particular that I didn't mention that you would like me to mention, I'm happy to answer those questions now.
Good stuff, dude.
Thank you.
So Nick, yeah, let's go for that one.
Yeah, I see Nikki's question here. So what's the process for creating a new entry in EE where the images aren't already uploaded to the storage service? So you would want to use some sort of software tool that automatically moves files that are uploaded to your Expression Engine installation into S3 or DigitalOcean Spaces or whatever it is. So Treasury, that is by TJ, I mentioned, and I think there are some other options as well. And then a lot of the time, that kind of software, if they're installed and there are images on the server that aren't in that external service, you'll have maybe a button you can push to sync. Thank you, Jared. That's a key criteria. Satisfies my OCD as well, except it gives me a little freak out because you see the markup and it looks like this, which is gross. But from the user's perspective, they're never going to notice. They're just going to get a perfectly sized, beautiful image that loads super fast, and that's what matters to them.
It makes it look like you worked really, really hard.
Oh, so. Yeah, did a lot of Mike asks, do all browsers support these tags? I think probably 95% of browsers at this point support source set. I think even IE11 to some degree. No, IE11 doesn't. So IE11 will fall back to whatever source declaration you have here, which these tools will also insert for you. So you can see here, I'm getting my kind of base image as the source at the bottom of this tag.
Ty, do you feel like you have to, so like you have your clients set up their own account, right? And so I thought that billing question's probably the first thing I thought about is when you make them set up the account and make them put their card in it, do you, like when you're getting projects, have to sell this to them a little bit? Or how does that kind of work when you kind of explain to them, hey, here's a $10 a month bill you're going to have?
Totally.
Like, how do you do that?
Yeah. It's a conversation. I think, most of our clients, when we go in, we prep them and we say, there's going to be some ongoing costs with your site that you need to be aware of. And this is one that we just always insert kind of upfront, or not always, but when we think it will make sense for the project.
Sure.
So yeah, it's just about, I think, that transparency, and almost all the time clients are okay with it. The one thing we've had trouble with sometimes is like enterprise clients, actually. Of course, they can afford the $10 a month, but the act of like getting a credit card to pay for something
takes forever.
Like, So it's like red tape, like you wouldn't believe. So sometimes we do just like take the bill on ourselves and pass it to us or whatever.
Yeah, the CEO has to like bang crystals together, an accountant has to like turn a stone, and yeah, I get it.
Yeah. Justin, how do you decide whether this makes sense for a project? It's a great question. So we think about it based on traffic, based on the number of images on the website, how performance intensive the site is going to be, and the use cases. So if a site's going to be used on mobile primarily, we want to make sure that the image experience on mobile is really, really great, and that we're not slowing things down even a fraction of a second. If a site's getting thousands of hits a day, it's worth shaving off maybe a couple milliseconds per image load even, because that will mount. But if, for a small business, potentially for like a restaurant website, for, a personal website, it's probably overkill. It adds some development overhead and work that you have to do. So it's really that balance of like effort versus benefit. Yeah, Josh said, I could see issues when that credit card expires. I should have mentioned that because that has happened. We've had clients who got the you need to pay now message over and over and just didn't do anything, and then their Imgix went down.
You probably don't remember what it even is.
Yeah, exactly. Jared, does using a CDN affect SEO? Yes, your images aren't going to be on your domain, so that will affect affect things, I think. And the way we tend to mitigate that is by putting them on a subdomain at least, so at least they're associated. But I'm not sure if that actually fixes that association. That is a consideration, Jared.
Awesome. Well, we got another talk starting here in 1 minute, so Ty, I'm going to wrap things up if that's okay.
Thank you so much.
Dude, thank you so much for you coming here and being such a big part of this year. We really appreciate you, man. Thank you.
Glad to help. Sorry for rushing at the end. I'll answer other questions in the chat. And awesome talking with everybody. I really appreciate everyone's attention. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.